Live from ND Studios, Notre Dame, Indiana, this is the Rhythms of Faith podcast. Welcome back to the Rhythms of Faith podcast. We're thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Jessica Coblentz, who is a professor of Religious Studies and Theology and Gender and Women's Studies at St. Mary's College right across the street here. Jessica, welcome to Rhythms of Faith. Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks for having me. I'm delighted.
Would you start by just telling us a little bit about your background, how you found your way into academia and your particular discipline?
I would be happy to. I was a kind of strange kid in that I came to college with the idea that I wanted to be a religious studies major. That might be common at Notre Dame, but it is not common at St. Mary's. It's not common at most Catholic colleges even. But how I got to that point is a little strange as well. I grew up in the Seattle area in a Catholic family, but a pretty nominally Catholic family. We went to mass off and on, but my faith wasn't something that really infused my upbringing at home. Nevertheless, I was kind of an oddly religious kid. And especially as I grew into my teenage years, I just had this profound sense of God's presence and a real curiosity about religion. I went to public school all through growing up, so I never had the opportunity to take a religion class that might have given me some language or concepts or even community to help me sort out this deep sort of religious longing that I had. And so I was very intrigued as a teenager when I started to meet other friends, most of them from Protestant traditions, who really emphasize the importance of things like reading your Bible every day, or even like reading spirituality books. And so as a high school student, I started to do that. I would just go to the used bookstore and kind of like pick out theology books that seemed interesting, and thought it was just fascinating that there were people out there who were thinking about God and thinking about how we should live as Christians and striving to be better people in conversation with the Christian tradition. And so I ended up going to a Catholic university, and as I said, sort of had it in my head that I was going to major in religious studies, even though I had no idea what that actually entailed. But was fortunate that even in my first quarter, I had a required theology class taught by a wonderful Jesuit priest and church historian who just blew my mind with his presentation of the diversity of the church. I encountered for the first time a vision of the Christian tradition as one where disagreement and debate was welcome. So this sort of intellectual yearning that I had was really affirmed in that first class. And from then on, I was really taken. Because it was a religious studies department, I was not only taking theology classes like this first one, but ritual theory and sociology of religion and all sorts of things, such that by the time I graduated, I was just overwhelmed by the possibilities of what I could continue to study. I hadn't met a professor until I went to college, at least to my knowledge. Yeah. And so it wasn't until I was really immersed in the discipline that I realized, there are people who do this with their lives. They teach and they talk and they debate. And this seems like something worth pursuing. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that as a theologian. I was really fascinated by how Christianity and religion more broadly seemed to be a sort of source of inspiration for people, a balm, a comfort for people in times of distress. And also, religion seemed to be the source of a lot of pain in people's lives, even oppression at times. And so I set out for graduate school thinking, maybe I'll be a professor. I want to study religion. I want to study this tension that I see in Christianity, how it can help and hurt people. But I didn't know that theology was necessarily for me. So I went to Harvard Divinity School, which is a kind of multi-faith, multidisciplinary graduate school, and took all sorts of classes my first semester there, but very quickly realized that it was theology that I wanted to do. I wanted to study and think with Christianity in a way that allowed me to speak back to my own tradition and to think of new, ideally more life-giving ways for us to be church together and to move forward as a church. So since then, I've just been sort of hooked on theology and was really fortunate a few years ago to end up at St. Mary's, where I've been teaching for the last 7 years. What do
you attribute that sort of like openness to God or faith or spirituality and early in your life to, kind of in retrospect now?
Sometimes I think it was just like the gift of faith. I don't know. Like some people feel a sense of connection to God more easily than others. I think part of it was just purely experiential. And even that experience of God has changed quite a lot in my life. I wouldn't say that I have that same connection to God that I once did. I'd also say, though, that, one of the benefits of growing up in the family that I grew up in and in the place that I grew up in the Seattle area, is that I was really encouraged to sort of explore and ask big questions about life. Even within my own family, there were Protestant Christians, secular Buddhists, our best friends were Jewish. So there was always this sense that there was many ways that people were making sense of God and living in community together. And I was lucky to have parents who always encouraged me to just sort of ask big questions about the world. And so I think the intersection of that environment and this just sort of personal disposition gave me this kind of openness to not only experiencing God, but sort of seeking understanding, I suppose, about what I was experiencing.
Very cool. Yeah, thank you.
We want to talk, and I'm kind of inspired by what you said about religion as a source of suffering and also religion as a source of healing. And of course, we wanted to talk to you a little bit about your groundbreaking book, Dust in the Blood, about problematic Christian theologies of depression, and then a more constructive way of approaching a theology of depression as Christianity. So would you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, happy to. As I just said, I've long been fascinated with this tension in Christianity, particularly around experiences of suffering. Suffering, for many of us, is an experience that rouses these big questions about God. Why is this happening to me? What am I supposed to do about it? Is there a purpose to this or something? And that fascination stuck with me all through graduate studies. And I found myself early in my doctoral studies with years of thinking about these issues around suffering behind me, with my own really severe experience of depression. I found it to be quite debilitating, so much so that I almost had to leave my doctoral program. Fortunately, I got the help that I needed to be able to come back. But when I did, I was sort of haunted, troubled maybe by the fact that I had been studying Christian theologies of suffering for many, many years at that point. And I had never, ever read anything about depression, never even encountered it. Not in an academic book. I don't think I ever heard anyone talk about it in a homily or in a faith sharing context. And so it struck me that this was an opportunity for me to explore some of the questions that came up for me from my own experience, but also, of course, depression isn't just my experience. It affects a lot of us. And it seemed to me that Christianity should have something to say to this experience. And so that sort of set me on a course to this book. And while, as I said, there weren't a lot of kind of academic conversation partners when it came to talking about depression from a Christian perspective, I found that people were talking about depression outside of the academy. They were talking about it in self-help books. If you go looking for them, you can find them online, on magazines and things like that. So part of the early work of my research was sort of collecting from all these various sources what people were actually saying about depression. And what I found was that there were kind of two big groups of thought that were circulating, at least in the US Christian context. Some people were saying that depression is the result of a person's sinfulness. So you did something bad and God is punishing you with depression, for example. Or more common in Catholic context was this idea that depression was actually a sort of gift from God, something that was meant to help you grow in your spiritual life and sort of strengthen your relationship with God. And while both of these appealed to people, including some depression sufferers for various reasons, I heard from a lot of depression sufferers that I was reading about that this also left a lot to be desired. And so a big aim of my book was to sort of articulate these popular theologies of depression that are circulating, but also to offer some other ways of thinking about depressive experience from within the Christian tradition, ways of thinking about depression that didn't necessarily justify it or explain it away, which I think sometimes these other ways of thinking can do. And also ways that are true to some of the more harrowing dimensions of depression, the experiences of meaninglessness and hopelessness and sort of diminished freedom and agency that people experience. So that's what I've tried to do in the book. And my hope is that other people, other Christians, especially theologians, will continue to write about this condition because I think we need a lot more on this topic.
Yeah. Could you give us a little survey of some of the things that you've uncovered in the ways that you address the sort of popular theology, and then what are some of your responses?
Yeah. So what I found was that the appeal often of these popular theologies is that they give people an answer to the question, like, why is this happening? So if you say depression is the result of sin, that might sound kind of harsh and stigmatizing. Many people experience it that way, but also some people are drawn to that way of thinking because if I did something to deserve my depression, that means it's in my control.
Right.
And I can do something.
Yeah, thank God I finally figured out why.
Exactly. Repent and it'll go away, right? That's the sort of promise of that way of thinking. And analogously, this idea that depression is a gift that can help us grow, I mean, that often inspires people to persevere, right? I feel terrible and miserable and hopeless now, but my church is telling me that someday I'm going to see the silver lining of all of this. And so that, again, can be very hopeful. At the same time, many people don't see a silver lining in their suffering. And many people feel like this can be a sort of like a message of toxic positivity, right? When you're feeling miserable and people around you are telling you like, no, it's actually a good thing, right? So one of the things I wanted to do was to articulate a Christian theology of depression that really honored how difficult this is, that gave people a reason to hope, but one that didn't require them to downplay just how difficult this is. And one of the things I found as I studied depression memoirs, people's sort of first-person accounts of depression, was that people often described their depression as a sort of dislocation from their ordinary lives. Like they are living in a whole other world than they used to live in. And this other world of depression was difficult, sometimes even life-threatening. It was utterly unpleasant. And as I listened to more and more descriptions of depression like this, it started to remind me of other stories from the Christian tradition that I'd heard of. It reminded me of many of the wilderness stories that we have in our scriptures, which tell all sorts of stories of people finding themselves living, often unwillfully, in inhospitable landscapes. Where it's difficult to survive, where they don't know how they're ever going to get out of it, things that deeply resonated with many accounts of depression. And so I ended up focusing on one particular wilderness story from the scriptures, the story of Hagar from the book of Genesis. And she has multiple wilderness experiences, but the one that I found so inspiring for a theology of depression is when she sort of cast out from the clan of Abraham, one of the sort of patriarchs in the Old Testament, and finds herself with an infant child on the brink of death in the middle of the wilderness. And she cries out to God for help because she thinks her son and her, she thinks they're going to die. And on one hand, disappointingly, God does not rescue them. God does not fix their problem. God does not come in and say, here's why you have to be here. Here's why this is happening to you. God doesn't explain or justify this really difficult situation she's in. But God does answer her. And God opens her eyes to a well of water that helps her and her son survive. And the scripture suggests that they continue to live in the wilderness for a very long time. To me, what this suggests is that sometimes suffering doesn't have an explanation that God gives us. It doesn't have a justification, unlike these other popular theologies of depression that I was studying. At the same time, God does care, God hears, God sees, and in a way, God accompanies Hagar in her suffering in the wilderness. Furthermore, God opens her eyes to new possibilities for living in a situation that she did not think she could live through. And what I heard from a lot of depression sufferers was a similar story of survival and improved quality of life. Often, God doesn't just cure us from our depression. It's a long and arduous journey through this difficult condition. But people often said the things that helped them survive and live better with depression were these little emergent possibilities, like Hagar who saw water that she didn't see before. And this accompaniment that I think God offers her is so important. And so that's sort of what I advance as another way that we can think from within the Christian tradition about these kinds of difficult wilderness experiences of depression today.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm wondering if, and this might go against everything you just said, but like the work of research and writing a book is so arduous and one step at a time and all of this kind of incremental progress. But in that story that you just told, was there like an aha moment where like you were kind of, hitting your head against the wall, trying to figure out like, I know it's not this, but it could be X and aha. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know who said this. I got to look this up. Somebody that I read once said that like writing a book is an act of hope. You start it with one idea and then you kind of have to give yourself. Yeah, there was an organic process by which like I was serving all these other ways of thinking about depression and nothing was quite landing in the way that I was looking for. And so it was when I started to connect the stories of depression sufferers to the wilderness stories that I started to say, I think there's something here, but I didn't know that it was Hagar's story. I started to read all of this sort of biblical scholarship about wilderness experiences and started to notice, oh, there's some differences among these. And so there was a sort of aha moment. I had my own eyes opened.
Yeah, very cool.
And am grateful for that. But you're right. I mean, that is a lot of research is that sort of trusting the process. For me, it was very important to follow the experience of depression sufferers. And I felt like if I did that, they would lead me to something that would hopefully be useful to other depression sufferers and those who accompany them.
Very cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
I love that narrative, and it intersects with the class. I'm going to try to make this into a question. We'll see if I get there. It intersects with the class because one of the things that I was thinking of as you were describing Hagar's narrative within this context of like the experience of people who are suffering from depression is I was thinking about the way that these theologies of depression are really about God and about depression, but Hagar speaks to God and then listens to God. So it's like a different kind of dynamic. It's not like, what can we say about God, but it becomes relational.
Mm-hmm.
And we spend a lot of time in the class. Well, not enough time. There's never enough time for anything in that class, but we spend time in the class with the Lament Psalms and the way that the Lament, like for me, at least, what's unique about my experience of Lament Psalms is that it takes, my experience of bad things and it makes it something that's to God instead of something that's about the experience of suffering. And I don't know if you can turn that into a question for me. I didn't make it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I similarly have been struck by the ways that these lament psalms, they sound like complaining, right? Which for some of us, depending on the kind of Christian community or faith community or just even kind of cultural environment we're raised in, might seem like a bad thing. It's bad to complain, particularly to God. But it's always struck me that it's a profound act of faith, right? You are assuming that there is a God out there who cares enough to listen to your cries, or else you wouldn't cry. And I do think that a similar act of faith is evident in Hagar's story, right? Yeah, not only does she cry out to God, but as you said, she's the first woman in at least the chronology of Scripture to name God, the first person to name God. And she names God the God who sees. A God who she believes is present to her, right? She names her son Ishmael, God hears, right? And so I do think the Lament Psalms are grounded in an assumption of relationship with a God who cares, who may or may not respond back, particularly in the way we want, but one who is there and is present. And again, especially in the context of depression, but I think also for a lot of us who are in these moments of distress, right? We may want a fix, a rescue, an explanation, but often the things that help us the most is just the presence of others, whether it's a divine presence or the presence of other people who care and are willing to be with us while we're pissed off and frustrated and all that.
Yeah. And it's like, and I think also a lot of times it's not that we want our problems to be fixed. I mean, it's interesting that she was able to say, God sees, God hears, when, as you say, he didn't, come riding into the desert with like a whole setup or, send her back to a family that no doubt she didn't want to leave. But what I think it's other people a lot of times that want to fix the situation, and really what's needed is that presence, that kind of assurance of we're not going to abandon you. I think a lot of times we make mistakes as a church because we're trying to rush in and we think what's needed is a fix, instead of being willing to be there in the distress with a person who's distressed. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
How'd you come up with the name of the book?
Dust in the Blood. This is a line from the poet Robert Lowell, who himself experienced bipolar depression. And I was listening to a podcast interview just like this one while I was finishing my dissertation and starting to think about the book. And I heard an interview with Lowell's biographer, where she was talking about how Lowell described his manic episodes as fire in the blood and his depressive episodes as dust in the blood. And I was just immediately taken by this expression. partially because I had already started to think about depression as a wilderness experience, and the dust imagery was sort of resonant with that kind of earthiness of the wilderness. But also this idea that depression is something that is running through your veins, like dust in the blood, really struck me as somebody who at this point had been really immersed in the stories of other depression sufferers, but also who had experienced depression myself. What I found was that depression sufferers often said, like, I don't have the words to describe what this experience is like. People think it's sadness, but we all get sad sometimes. And they're like, no, it's something different. As I mentioned earlier, they often end up saying, like, it's all encompassing. They feel it in their bodies. So it's not just a sort of mental thing. And it's much more all encompassing. And I felt like this descriptor, dust in the blood, had this bodily resonance that tracked with what people were reaching for. I also think that the poetic quality of it is fitting because when we can't explain things in ordinary language, we often reach for metaphor, for figurative language. I also think, not just poetry, but the arts and things like that to sort of capture this experience that we have that's out of the reach of our ordinary speech. And so it seemed fitting that the line from a poet who could say something better than I could would be the one that I would adopt for the book.
Yeah. Awesome title. And great find too.
Thank you.
Really
yeah. And just like
title.
a coincidence. A very, very happy coincidence. Yeah.
That's great. And I know you're working on a piece about a song right now. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about that project?
Yeah, when I finished Dust in the Blood, I thought I would never write anything else about depression. I was like, I gave this all I got. I'm done.
I'm done with
We've
it.
all been there.
Yeah.
But one of the scary and beautiful things about sharing scholarship is once it's out in the world, other people have things to say about it. And as I said, well, that can be scary sometimes. It can also be really generative. And so after talking to people about the book, I realized that I had another book on depression in me. So I'm currently writing another book on depression. This book is a book specifically looking at women's depression. Women experience depression at 2 to 3 times the rate of men. And there's some really interesting psychological scholarship and social scientific scholarship exploring why that is. And so I'm engaging some of that literature. And that scholarship suggests that ideas of womanhood and what it means to be a good woman often are one factor in why women experience depression at such higher rates. And so I'm bringing that insight into conversation with Mariology, the study of Mary. And in the process of talking about Mary, I've been sort of collecting artifacts that help me open up certain facets of who Mary is and ideas about womanhood that are mediated through popular practice as well as theological reflection on her. One of the songs that a friend recommended to me when she heard I was studying Mary is the song titled Mary by the American folk singer and songwriter Patty Griffin. It was written decades ago and has been covered many different times. But one of the really interesting things about the song is that it starts off talking about a woman named Mary. And actually the singer is singing to this woman named Mary. And there's a couple verses like that. And then there's a sort of chorus where Jesus is mentioned and you realize you might have suspected that this was Mary, the Mother of God, but now we have an explicit mention of Jesus. This is a song about Mary, the Mother of Jesus. But as she goes on to describe this Mary, you just I at least feel very sad for the woman that's described. She talks about Jesus sort of heading out on his mission and her being sort of left behind to grieve alone. And so it struck me as a sort of contemporary song about Mary that resonates with other hymns about Mary that have been really important to the Christian tradition at other points in history. Particularly, I'm writing about the image of Mary as Our Lady of Sorrows, which focuses a lot on Mary at the foot of the cross. And in the Middle Ages, at least in the Western Church, these Marian laments, speaking of lament, were popularized where people were singing to Mary. They're actually dialoguing with Mary at the foot of the cross and relating her suffering and grief to their suffering and grief. So this song has sort of inspired me to connect that medieval practice to kind of contemporary experiences of womanhood and of Mary today.
That's great.
Amazing.
And of course, this is like very important for the Holy Cross sisters.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what I know. I hadn't thought much about Our Lady of Sorrows until I came to St. Mary's, because she is the sort of patroness of the Holy Cross sisters, and I think the priests and brothers too.
Right. The whole order, yeah.
And so I worship with the Sisters of the Holy Cross every Sunday at the Church of Loretto, and they have these beautiful mosaics, one of which is this sort of brooding depiction of Our Lady of Sorrows. And I think, it was Sunday after Sunday of sitting underneath this mosaic and looking at her that actually got me to start to think, like, this woman looks awfully familiar to, like, she looks like somebody who is just turned inward by her suffering in a way that resonates with many people's experience of depression. So I have the congregations of the Holy Cross to thank a little bit for this interesting turn to Mariology that I've taken and that connected me with this song as well.
That's great.
All right, this is going to be a question like Kim's before. Like, can I form it into a question?
Go for it.
But I'm really curious about like that creative process before you've decided to write the book, or the next project or the next article or whatever that is. And especially from the perspective of how personal you've made this work. In the class that we teach, a lot of times we find that the things that are most personal are the things that ought to be the furthest away from the work that I may create, because it might expose me or it might make people think less of me. Like, how do you think? You've done the opposite. And so what might you say to young people, students who are really trying to discern how they can speak their authentic voice with the gifts and talents that they have, but maybe think of the things that are, you could argue, the most interesting things about them as the kind of off the table for where their research or creative work could go?
It's a great question. I find that the work of writing and creation is so difficult in and of itself that I often have to have some sort of personal connection in order to persevere. Like, I have to care enough about this to stick with it. And so, it's sometimes experiences like my own depression. Sometimes it's experiences of anger and frustration. I realize I'm like super annoyed about something, and that's often a signal that maybe there's something I need to write about here. And sometimes what I do is I give myself permission to start a project by writing myself into it. So sometimes that's as simple as like a first draft where I do say, like, I tell my own story. Sometimes it's a very vulnerable story. And that sort of helps me clarify what's at stake for me so that then I can write another version of the same project that doesn't include my personal narrative. That's happened sometimes. And other times I realize in the process of putting my own vulnerable experience on the page that it's actually not as scary as I thought. Sometimes maybe we've had these experiences even with friends where you're nervous about disclosing something, but then when you do it, and you're met with hospitality and warmth and affirmation, you realize, oh, like this isn't actually something I need to be afraid of. So sometimes that happens to me too. I think I'm maybe going to take out the personal stuff, but I realize, no, I actually think this is essential. I'm going to leave it.
Yeah.
That being said, I feel like there have been tremendous blessings that have come from me sharing my own story in this work. There have also been real challenges with that vulnerability. People often meet my vulnerability with theirs. So I've heard from a lot of people about their own mental health struggles. I've heard about their loved ones. That's been a tremendous gift for people to share their stories with me. But sometimes it's also really hard.
Yeah.
I've had to learn how to carry those stories with me. I've had to learn also like how to better accompany other people.
Yeah.
And
Didn't know you were signing up for that.
I didn't know. I
Yeah.
did not know I was signing up for that. And also I think, I decided over many years of working on this book that I wanted to disclose my own experience of depression, but there are lots of things about my life that I don't care to disclose.
Right.
Sure.
And so I always want to encourage, especially with students who many of whom have been like raised in this social media culture where like, I think sometimes we get the impression that like, in order to be an authentic and truthful person, you have to advertise everything that's going on. I really encourage some sort of slow discernment about personal disclosures, not because there's anything to be ashamed of, but just because sometimes putting yourself out there, especially when it's things that are dear to you, is a risk.
Right.
And also a risk that sometimes comes with responsibility when other people return that vulnerability to you. But getting it out in other ways as a part of the creative process has been an important practice regardless of what direction I go in.
Yeah, like absolutely intrinsic from what you're saying. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, awesome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool.
Well, great. That's actually a really nice connection to, we were going to ask you one of the questions that our students might choose to talk about in their final exam for this class, which the question that we want to ask you is like, what does it mean to be church? So like in your case, like in the context of, the work you've done on depression and accompaniment that you've talked about, like how does that impact how you think about the church and what it means to be church?
I think the word you mentioned, accompaniment, is crucial for me. For me, the church at its core is it's Christians. It's a Christian community being Christ to one another and to the world. And essential to that is accompaniment. I think as we were talking about earlier, sometimes, especially in academic contexts, like the ones we're in, we can confuse the Christian life with, giving explanations and sort of defenses of our faith. And, making sure that we're always ready with an answer from a Christian perspective for everything that can happen. I obviously care a lot about like good argumentation. I wouldn't be a theologian if I wasn't. But I think all of that to me is at least secondary to our call to be a loving presence to one another, and to people beyond the church and the wider world. And often, as you mentioned earlier, this emphasis on explanation and justification, easy answers can get in the way of us just being patiently loving towards one another, especially when it's really, really difficult. I'm thinking, like, I talk about this a little bit in the book. One of my favorite church documents of recent years was an apostolic exhortation from Pope Francis on holiness, where he does a sort of modern interpretation of the Beatitudes. And in his reflection on blessed are those who mourn, which we just heard last
Yeah.
week at Mass. He says, like, in our modern age, we don't know how to mourn. We have so many distractions, but also, you know, we just reach for other things to turn our attention away from the people who are suffering in front of us, or even our own suffering in our own lives. We want a quick fix. And he said, no, like, blessed are those who know how to stay with people who are struggling, to accompany. And I think he's right that that's one of our really important tasks as Christians today.
Beautiful. We finish every episode by asking a silly question.
Okay.
And that question is, if you had to choose to be one animal, what would it be and why?
I have long been obsessed with hippopotamuses or hippopotami, hippos. Ever since I was a kid, I think I was drawn to their sort of complicated reputation. On one hand, they're known as like fierce killers, very aggressive. On the other hand, they're like so cute and chubby with their stout little legs. They just float around all day.
In the water, out of the water.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, like, I like to think like I've got some fierceness in me, but that I'm also sort of cute and cuddly. You know? I try to inhabit both of those things. Yeah.
Jess, thank you so much for coming to join us. It's really been a delight to have you here, and I've learned a lot. So thank you so much. And we appreciate you being here on the podcast and helping our students and others think about these issues as well.
No, my pleasure. It's great to be in conversation.
Yeah. And now we want to thank you also for joining us here on the Rhythms of Faith podcast.